Nye the Science Guy.
Hello, this is our limiting reactant lab report video, in which we will go over the chemical reaction between potassium hydroxide and copper sulfate. This process will demonstrate the main law of stoichiometry, which is the law of conservation of mass. In this experiment, we utilized two burettes, one filled with potassium hydroxide and the other filled with copper sulfate. We also used 8 test tubes, a glass stirring rod, a graduated cylinder, and a bottle of distilled water to conduct this experiment.
We began by filling each test tube with 5 ml of copper sulfate, and we increased the amount of potassium hydroxide by 1 ml for each test tube until we ended up with 8 ml on the 8th test tube. We then added the appropriate amount of distilled water to have each test tube with 13 ml of solution. After having the appropriate amount of solution, we used the glass stirring rod to stir the solution and let it settle for 15 minutes. After waiting, we observed that precipitates had formed at varying quantities, with only some test tubes containing a supernatant. A precipitate is the solid formed in a liquid solution, and a supernatant is the liquid left over above the precipitate.
After measuring our precipitates, here are our results. We found that the height of the precipitate increased as the amount of potassium hydroxide increased until test tube 5. Test tube 5 jumped and began to level off due to the change in the limiting reactant. When the amount of potassium hydroxide became greater than the amount of copper sulfate, the limiting reactant changes. The limiting reactant is the reactant that limits the amount of product able to be produced. In test tube 4, we had an error. Instead of increasing, it decreased. We believe that this was due to human error. Before, we had added too much distilled water to the test tube and had to dump it out and refill it. This may have caused the error.